Perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. My name's Emily and I'm a guide with California State Parks, and I welcome you to your tour on the California mission history. So today on this tour, we're going to be learning a little bit about general history of the missions, history of the mission I'm at, Mission San Francisco Solano, and their effects on the California Indians. And yes, I am coming to you live today from the Mission San Francisco Solano in Sonoma, California. So if you guys aren't quite sure where Sonoma is, we're at the north end of the San Francisco Bay, about an hour or so north of San Francisco. And while we're on this tour today, if you guys have questions, go ahead, throw it in the chat. I'll try to take those as best I can as they're coming in, or when there's kind of appropriate more times to take questions. I'll also probably at certain times ask if anyone does have a question and take those then. If you're having any problems with the stream, try turning off your cameras, because if you turn off your cameras and just watch me, that tends to help with your streaming. So to begin with, I would like to acknowledge that the land the Mission San Francisco Solano is on is the ancestral land of the Coast Miwok, Southern Pomo, Wapo, and Patwin. They were the first people here before anyone came to colonize this area of Alta California. And that is exactly what Spain was doing with the missions. They were colonizing the land, taking control away from the California Indians and making it their own. And they did this with the mission system. So the basic idea of a mission was this, that the priests and soldiers went into an area they wanted to build at. They would round up the local California Indians to become their laborers. They were teaching them trades and customs they wanted them to know. In 10 years, these sites were to become self-sustaining, meaning they're producing almost everything they needed to survive. At that point in time, they could then open up into a town, with the California Indians becoming representatives of Spain. Now, the idea behind that was, should another country like England, France, or Russia try to invade, they then had people there to protect that site. However, it doesn't quite happen this way. And we know this because of how the missions are built. So our first mission built in California was way down south in San Diego. That's San Diego de Alcala, built in 1769. A little over 50 years later, by 1821, well, 20 missions had been built, being run the same way they always had been. But by this time, we're now part of the country of Mexico. So nothing has changed in over 50 years. So how does the 21st and last mission get built? Well, come follow me to find out. Sounds like to always check. All right. So the Mission San Francisco Solano was established by a priest named Father Altamira. And Father Altamira was a priest working at Mission San Francisco Diocese, more commonly known as Mission Dolores in San Francisco. And he wasn't really too happy with some of the conditions of the mission. First off, San Francisco was not really an ideal location to be raising the animals of a mission. So what kind of animals were they raising at a mission? Well, they had cows, horses, sheep, goats, donkeys, oxen, pigs, very common. So a lot of what we consider today farm animals. And for the most part, these are what we consider raising animals. So they'll eat the grasses in an area for their food. San Francisco, not really providing that. Also, San Francisco, with its climate, not an ideal location to be growing the crops or food of a mission. So common foods at a mission being grown were things like wheat. Wheat is the #1 most important crop. Corn, lentils, beans, kidney beans, pinto beans, barley. And then they were growing lots of fruit there. You know, Spain brought a lot of new plants to the Americas, planting them here in California. Things like orange trees, lemon trees, pears, pomegranates, olives, grapes. So a lot of food production also went on at a mission. Not ideal in San Francisco. And then last, the Ohlone, the indigenous people to that area. That was not a traditional year-round site for them. So health-wise, they suffered there. Now, Father Altamira had an idea. He actually wanted to close down Mission San Francisco Diocese, as well as Mission San Rafael and just opened up a huge new mega mission in the North Bay regions. But in order to do this, he needed approval. And well, at first he got approved by the government because the government liked the idea, as the Russians are now on our coastline. They had colonies in Bodega. They built a fort. We know it as Fort Ross today. So they like that idea. But the church, well, he was supposed to get approval by the church first, and he didn't. When they heard, they actually weren't too excited by that. And they told him, we won't give you permission to close any missions, but in the end, we'll give you permission to build one. So by the summer of 1823, Father Altamira was officially given permission to build what became the 21st and last mission San Francisco Solano. Now, I don't know if you guys have any questions, but just remember, type them into chat if you do. It's a good way for me to see them come in and I can take them that way. Now, if we look at how Mission San Francisco Solano is built, we get an idea for how a lot of the missions are built, because most are built on what we call a quadrangle. So that's a four-sided structure with an open courtyard. Now, in the case of this mission, we know they started out with a wooden built church as one of the first buildings to go up. Churches are important to the missions, but we'll talk more about that towards the end of the tour. The next building to go up is the priest's quarters. Then they'd start building necessary work and storage rooms. In the back, they have what's known as the Monjerio, or the women's dormitory. And at this mission, on the east side, they finished off last with a much larger Adobe Brick church. So those are the buildings of the missions. But where exactly are people living? Well, if you're the priest, you live in the priest's quarters. Now, Father Altamira was here for only about 3 years. He then left, and over this mission's 11-year history, there would be 3 additional priests as its leaders. Now, there were soldiers at a mission. 6 to 12 soldiers and their families could be found at one. They, for the most part, lived outside the mission walls in their own Adobe Brick homes. Now, for the California Indians who were here, the Coast Miwok, Southern Pomo, they also, too, mostly lived outside the main compound in their own traditional homes. So that's the building and where people are living at the mission. But did you know missions are so much more than this? Because we talked about raising animals and growing food. So you need a lot of land to do that. In the case of this mission, the land stretched about 30 miles north to south. And east to west, it stretched about 60 miles with a cattle ranch on each side. So about 18 miles northwest of us in Santa Rosa would have been one cattle ranch, and about 40 miles east of here in the area of present-day Fairfield, Vacaville would have been the second cattle ranch. So when you're learning about missions, know they're much more than the buildings you just see today, because it also impacted all the land surrounding it. All right, I don't know if anyone has any questions. Good time to chat, type them into chat if you do. See if any come in, but I'm gonna kind of move us over to a new area.
So I have a couple of questions for you.
Sure.
So you were talking about how some of the indigenous groups wouldn't have lived in one location year round. How big of a change was that when the missions came in? What was the impact of that?
Well, the missions changed a lot for the indigenous people in the area. And by the way, just so you guys know, I do use the term California Indian a lot. It is a term approved by the tribe we work with in state parks, which is Great Rancheria with our park. But indigenous, Native American, all approved terminology to use when we're talking about the first people. So it did impact because depending on where people were tending to plants for food or where their natural hunting grounds were, where the missions went, they disturbed that area. So if they disturbed an area people were naturally getting food from, that wasn't a good thing. And then also at the mission, you weren't necessarily moving around a lot. You were centered at one place the whole entire time, which isn't necessarily good for the ecosystem. So that was changing a lot of what was going on. And you had another question?
Yeah, so my second question is, you said the first two missions in the Bay Area were not ideal. How did they pick this location for Solano?
Okay, so that's a good question. So one of the thought processes behind it was at this point in time, before Mexico and during Spain time, they hadn't really explored this area, which is present day like Sonoma County, Napa County, and they called it the Contra Costa del Norte, which we actually get some words for our area today. So they knew about this area, they knew about the indigenous populations up here, but they weren't necessarily looking to settle it right away. It wasn't until Russia arrives around 1812 that even Spain then started to go, maybe we need to start looking at this area. Maybe we need another protection up here because we don't want Russia taking over our lands. So the missions were a way of protection, but they weren't really set to go ahead and set up another mission right away. So it really wasn't until Father Altamira, not happy with the conditions in San Francisco, that he pushes for a new mission and then finally gets approval. So if I answered that. Yeah. Any more questions? I know someone had typed into chat, what did the Native Americans do on the missions? And that's a good question. That's kind of like a great segue for me to now talk about work at a mission. So when I do talk about work and I'm using terms like workers, laborers, people, do remember I am referring to the California Indians that worked at this mission, or any of the missions for that part. So cooking was an important job at a mission because people had to eat. So cooking could take place over stoves. They don't have gas or electricity in this time. They have wood burning stoves. So they're doing a lot of cooking outside. They're also using these hornos or wood fire ovens. Might look like a pizza oven to some of you, but as a reminder, they don't serve pizza in the mission era. But how many meals a day are they exactly serving at a mission? Well, it is 3. So the day typically starts with breakfast. Breakfast is a meal of atole. Atole is like a cream of wheat. Then after breakfast on a typical day, people will go to work. After work, partway through the day during work, it's time to take a break. And that break is known as dinner, not lunch. So people will come in for a larger meal, and that meal normally is a meal of pozole. Now today we know pozole is a wonderful Mexican soup, but during the mission era, it's more of a bean soup, like corn, beans, and lentils go into it, and maybe they made some bread in that horno. After dinner, people will go back to work, and when the day comes to an end, it's time to come in and have the final meal of the day, known as supper. And once again, it is atole. So 3 meals are served a day at a mission, but there are some problems with these meals. First off, they aren't very high in calories. So let's say someone's a field worker. They plow the fields, they're tending to the crops. They exert a lot of energy or calories doing that. If they don't get that same amount of calories back through the food they're eating, they could be suffering from starvation. Also, new food groups were added into the Native American diet. Things like cow's milk and the European wheat. Not having these foods before, some people's bodies couldn't digest them very well, and they simply were getting sick off the foods they were being served. Now, also at a mission, they are raising sheep because sheep have wool. So I don't know how many of you have ever smelled wool that came fresh off a sheep, but ooh, it's kind of stinky. So wool needs to be washed and dried. Now this is a several step process. Wool will be washed and dried, and then it goes to the carders. People whose job simply is to brush that wool out, getting it ready for its next process. And that process is spinning. So missions did have big spinning wheels on them called walking wheels, or they might have used this, a drop spindle, simply to make that wool into a usable piece of yarn. That yarn then goes to people who work the looms to make things like clothing or blankets. Because they don't have stores like Target in the mission era, so we can't just go shop for the items we need. They have to be made on site. This idea of sustainability. And how is that different for the California Indians? Well, let's think back to what they were wearing before the missions ever came here. Perhaps they wore clothing made out of deer or elk hide. Maybe they took fibers from grasses and made a skirt. But now that the missions are here, the priest wants the California Indians to dress a certain way. For women, it's to wear tops and skirts. For men, it's to wear tops and pants. So there's definitely some new styles of clothes, new types of fabric. It was different for the California Indians. But something that doesn't change during this time period is a tradition that goes back centuries, and that is making baskets. So baskets were seen as an important item to be used at a mission. So the tradition continues on because they could be used just about for anything, like hauling the harvest or storing the harvest, carrying water, or cooking it. Obviously, this basket, I'm not cooking in it, has lots of holes in it. But people who could make those baskets, that was really important to keep the mission running. So important traditions like that continue on in the mission era. Now, also at a mission, they're raising cows. They're raising cows really for two reasons. So in the fall, they have what's known as the Matanza season, the slaughtering season of the cows. And when they slaughter a cow, they want two items off of it, the hide and tallow. So hides are very useful at a mission. Hides can be taken and made into leather. Useful leather items include things like shoes, chaps for the vaqueros, those are our cowboys, saddles. Even the soldiers took it, layered it up, and made it into armor. Hides become so valuable as trade items that they eventually become known as the California buck because they're exchanged just like cash. Now, tallow is the fat of a cow, and that gets put into big pots like this one. So right now, this is hard, but I put a fire under here for 3 hours, and this is going to become a hot liquid. Then they take sticks with strings, dipping it up and down in that hot wax. And in about 30 minutes, you'd have a candle. So no electricity means candles are the way to see when it's dark out. And also with tallow, they made soap. So yes, in the mission era, people were bathing with beef fat. All right, so we're going to be walking across our courtyard now. So if anyone has any questions, this is a good time to type them into chat.
So you said that they continued having Native Americans who were at the missions making baskets. Was there any traditional foods that they continued to make while they were at the mission?
Yeah, they still continue to use the acorns as part of their food supply. And they also did go hunting for deer, because evidently deer tallow was very prized in the fall. So I don't know if that meant because it was cleaner burning or what, but it was known that people would ask for deer tallow and come trade at the missions if they had it. So they would get deer meat that way. They still fished in certain streams. So they did have fish still for some of their traditional foods, and still could collect berries and add those in for flavoring. So certain things did continue to take place, but it depended on the resources and the labor available to get them.
Okay, we have another question. Were the cactus used for something?
Okay, so that big cactus I just walked by, that cactus is about 140 years old. So it's a very old cactus. It's actually came up after mission era. So some missions might have used the cactus. They used them for a couple reasons. One was natural fencing. It does grow quite fast. Two, you can take the big paddles known as nopales, and you can use those for food. So they could have used them. It just would have come up really late up here to Northern California. So we don't really see them using it during the mission era up here. So great question. Any other questions?
So the next question, did they have any animals like ox to help them with the farming?
Yeah, so for the mission, Spain preferred oxen to use as a work animal, whereas the Americans, they use the horse. Draft horses obviously are for work, but they use the horses. Spain prized their horses, so they would use them for riding, and that was about it. They would not have used them to pull carts. So yes, oxen were there to pull the carts, to pull the plows. They were the work animals at a mission. Any other questions?
Yes. Where did they get all the animals at the mission? And were some of them there before the Spanish?
Good question. Where did they get? No, Spain brought the animals over here. Spain was very particular in what they wanted for food and what they wanted for animals. So they were bringing their own livestock and food sources to California. So once they had them started at an area, when a next mission would get started, they could send some up to that mission and then start breeding them up there. So they did like share resources as they went along, but they were all coming from Spain because they wanted there's a special, it's a black chicken that has like a white patch by it, the Spanish chicken. They actually have those at San Juan Bautista at the state park there. That's a special chicken that they wanted. So they had that. The horses, they wanted the Spanish horses. They wanted the Spanish longhorn cow. So all coming directly from Spain. Great question. And let's take one last question if there's one.
How did they make the stone and bricks behind you?
Oh, great. Let's go ahead and talk about that now. All right, so I am standing in front of an Adobe brick wall. And Adobe bricks are obviously what these buildings are made out of. So when the priest and soldiers go into an area, they don't have Home Depot, so they can't just go shop and buy what they need. They have to use resources on site. That's where the Adobe brick comes into. This building material goes back centuries. It's still used today in certain countries as well. So when it comes to making an Adobe brick, the first resource we have everywhere is dirt. So people, remember, California Indian laborers are the people who will start digging big pits, churning up that dirt. And then you're churning up the soil, the clay, the sand. That's ingredient number 2. We then start adding things into those big pits. Water, number 3. The fourth ingredient, that's straw or grasses, gets added in there. That kind of really stabilizes the brick, makes it strong when it dries out. And then sometimes there's a 5th magical ingredient added. I call it the magical ingredient because it's kind of like the glue of the brick. What binds everything together, makes it outside like rock hard solid when it dries out. And that is cow manure. So it is the job of the California Indians. They have to stomp on this mix in these pits, churning it up, mixing it around with their feet. Then they take rectangular molds, scoop it up, plop it in, smooth it out. These bricks take about 30 days to dry out in the sun. So 30 days is a long time to wait for your building materials. Means you have to be very aware of your rainy seasons. So up here in Northern California, maybe 6 to 7 months out of the year, they're making them before the rains start. Might be a little bit longer down in Southern California. And then you got to start building your buildings. So they're stacking the bricks up using more of that Adobe mix as the mortar or glue in between. So to give you an idea of how many bricks it's taking to do all this and the time and labor going into this, for one building, like the priest quarters, it takes about 16,000 bricks to make. That's the equivalent of one football field full of bricks laid end to end. For a church, it could take 2 football fields or more of bricks to build, over 32,000 bricks. So that's a lot of bricks for one building, for a second building, and there's probably about 6 to 8 going around the compound. So on average, it took about 10 years to fully build a mission compound. 10 years. The original idea of the missions, and in 10 years, these sites could be fully operational, become a town. actually wasn't very realistic if you can only get all your buildings done in 10 years. All right, so we're gonna walk back out into our courtyard. Any other questions before I go into the museum?
The next question is, how many people in all would live on each mission or this mission? And then I wanted to add, how many of those people would have been indigenous?
Okay, great question. All right. So on average, you could say there's probably around 800 people, because it can vary 600 to 1,000 Native American workers at a mission. And it's probably like 98% of the population is Native American. I mean, you have one priest, you have a dozen soldiers or so, and their families who maybe of Spanish descent, maybe of mixed Spanish indigenous descent, and then everyone else is indigenous at a mission. So it's like less than 2% is non-indigenous at a mission. So you have to think about that. It is really the indigenous laborers who are doing everything at the mission for this one person who is the priest. So it kind of gives you an idea of what's going on at a mission. Take another question.
What was their main mode of getting around? And I'm guessing the laborers too.
So about 3 different ways. Well, maybe 4. So walking. Walking is the first main way. Actually, one of the priest vows was to walk as much as possible anywhere you were going, unless you were injured, and then you were allowed to ride a donkey or a horse. So people did ride donkeys or horses. They did have the carretas or the carts, which could pull people around. And then the 4th way would be by boat. Being up here in Sonoma, actually the way to reach this mission, if you were coming from across the bay from Mission San Francisco de Asís, Mission San Rafael, or San Jose, you would actually take a boat across the bay, come up the Sonoma Creek, and then you had about a 4-mile walk or so to the actual mission compound. So in the San Francisco Bay Area, it wasn't uncommon to take boats part of the way to get to and from each mission. So great question. One more if we have it.
That's all our questions for now.
Okay, perfect. All right, so we're gonna go ahead on inside the mission now. I just have to put on my mask because we are under mask mandates here. So let me get that on. And then this is just kind of show you really quick a little bit of our courtyard. We will be passing a school group as I enter. So we do have on-site school tours that are going on as well. So just so you guys know. All right. So in our mission today, you have display cases and information on the mission. And then I'm going to go ahead and pass you. You guys, we have a school group. We have beautiful watercolors of the missions as they were standing in the early 1900s. And then we're walking towards the building most people think of when they think of a mission. And I may glitch. You guys are going to see there's this big, huge, thick wall I have to get through. Yeah. So I may glitch. Our data doesn't always like the thick Adobe Brick walls. But the building I was going to is the church. So I don't know how many of you have been to one of the 21 California missions before. Maybe you've been to the one right in your area. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Sonoma and seen this mission. If you've been in a church, this might look a little familiar to you. Or for some of you, maybe this is the first time seeing the interior of a church. So maybe it looks a little strange and different. Imagine for the California Indians, how different this building must have seemed. Because it really was the Catholic Church that changed traditional ways of our California Indians. Now, prior to the missions being here, one might say they practiced a spirituality or religion based off of nature. We know they gave thanks to when they killed it for its meat, hope and pray for a good acorn harvest, and they have a creator. But when the missions came, they wanted them to convert or change to their religion, Christianity. And that meant praying to people. So that's a very different concept and not an easy concept to adjust to. Now, not only were the California Indians put in charge of building the mission buildings like the churches, they were also put in charge of decorating the interiors. So when we start to look at mission churches a little closer, we start to see that they're overlapping some traditional ways of life with the new. Let's look up at the altar to kind of get what I'm talking about. So up here, you'll see in red a statue of Mary, in green is a statue of Joseph. There's a table, the crucifix, and a painting on the wall of the saint of this mission, San Francisco Solano. So that's all stuff the priest wants in here. It's important to him and his religion. But let's look up there again. Let's look a little bit closer at the walls. Behind the statues, you might notice there's leaves and vines coming out from behind them. Not something we see in a typical modern day church today. The colors, like they're what we call earthen tone colors. So we know for paint, the pigments and dyes are coming from nature, things like plants and minerals. We look to the ceiling. You'll notice there's design patterns on the beams. Those are based off of basket weaving designs. The ceiling is kind of like this sunset-y, salmon-y pink color. There's a bluish gray circle up in the center. That's what we call the eye of heaven. But who's heaven? Depends on who's in here. So the priest is up at the altar. Perhaps he feels a connection to his God standing under that heaven. But if someone's homo, they might feel a connection to their creator standing under that heaven. And lastly, I want to show you guys a design pattern that's on the wall, a design that goes around the whole entire mission. Let me see if I can get a little bit better on that. There we go. A little bit crooked, sorry. All right, so here you'll see a blue line with a brown wave going through. That's representing water. There's a big tan line going down the center that represents the earth. There are mountains and valleys. In this design, one of the translations for Sonoma is Valley of Moons, and then there's sky, stars, and trees. So when we look at this closer, we realize it's not just a design, but it's a picture of nature. A picture of nature that actually goes around the whole entire room, encircling the person who's in here. So it's tying traditional ways of life with the new. If there's any questions or comments, I can take those now.
Do you have any examples of what any art or painting by local groups before the missions were there that use some of those symbols?
No, we do not. Actually, what we're seeing inside the church today was all done in the 1960s, and it's based off of other missions. So people researched what other missions did, and they based the designs to incorporate nature into these. I know someone had I saw just popped up, wanted to see the vines more, so hopefully you can see that a little bit better. Any other questions?
Yeah, we've got a few more.
Okay.
What is the biggest mission, and when did people stop living in the missions?
Okay, that's a tricky question on the biggest mission, because when people think of missions, they tend to only think of the church itself. What they don't think about is the size of the compounds or the amount of land holdings with that mission. So for me, that's always a really tricky one to say what is the biggest, because there's different parameters, and that's something I don't have stored right in my mind, so I can't quite answer that one.
And then I have a classroom teacher, Ms. Harvey, and her class has a bunch of questions. So I was actually going to see if she wants me to unmute her. Miss, do you want to be unmuted or just put it in chat? I'm going to ask her directly. For Heather Harvey, do you mind if I unmute you? Oh, chat is best. Okay, so let me give you some of her class's questions. Were the natives allowed to leave? How did they get fresh water, and how did they make the paint?
Okay, so let's start with the water. So when you're building a mission, two things you're looking for are a area that has good land to grow food and raise animals on, and you're looking for water sources. So in this area, we have several creeks and streams, which can flow almost year round. And the hillsides are also an area of natural cold and hot springs. Right in this area, just 3/4 of a mile from the mission was a cold spring that was abundant with water. So that's where they were getting their water sources here. When it comes to leaving a mission, it depends on the mission and it depends on the priest. This mission was built so far into the mission era that eventually they started to allow certain of the California Indian laborers to return back to their tribal lands in the winter. The reason for that is that they really need people here for agriculture, and that revolves around spring, summer, and fall. So the planting, the tending, and the harvesting of crops. Come wintertime, there's not as much work to be done. So they don't want a lot of people just sitting around. So they would give them some food and then they would send them back. So that way their tribal families had to keep them fed throughout the winter, and the mission did it. So for the last question, the paint, they knew how to make paint back then. What exactly they were using here on the stucco walls, they might have mixed a little stucco in and mixed the dyes for the paints there. But their base for paint, off the top of my head, I don't recall what it is. Let's see, let's take 2 more questions.
Okay, do they still hold church services there? And does the church now look like it did back then?
Okay. So no, we don't hold services here anymore. There haven't been services here for regular services for over 100 years. That's because this is all part of a museum today. The church sold the property and they built a new church. So no services are held here today. We do special events like weddings, but no services. And then what was the other question?
Does the church look now like it did back then?
Oh, thank you. Does it look now like it did back then? In some aspects, yes. So you guys will see that there's no seating like you see in a modern day church. Rows of benches or pews or chairs. We only have a couple up against the wall. That's because in the mission era, this is how it would have looked. People had to stand or sit or kneel on the ground during the church services. We do have a rostrum, our raised pulpit is what I call it. This is where the priest would have stood to do readings or certain parts of the mass. It actually being up there. There are no microphones. It's great acoustics in these buildings, so everyone can hear. You have 200 people or more packed in this room. You have to be able to hear everyone. In the back is the choir loft. Choirs were very important in the mission era. They had very limited musical instruments. You had string instruments like violins, maybe some guitars, some wood instruments, but there were no pianos, no organs, no drums, anything like you have today. So that's very authentic. So in some ways it is like it was in the mission era. It's kind of stark, not a lot of decoration. We have the Stations of the Cross on the wall like they would have had back then. And just a few things in the room. It's not an elaborate church. It would never have been. This church was only in existence for 11 years. So very similar to how it would have been back then. Now, the missions do come to an end in 1834. That's when secularization is declared. And secularization is a pretty big word. Basically means the missions had to do what they were always supposed to do, become towns. General Mariano Guadalupe Vallejo was the Mexican military official chosen to come secularize the mission San Francisco Solano and start a new pueblo or town called Sonoma. In doing so, he took apart a lot of the mission buildings, repurposing materials to buildings in the town he was creating. He actually tore down the first wooden built church and built this Adobe Brick one we were just in. Now, like I said, it was only used as a church for about 40 years. Church then sold the property and moved 3 blocks away. It was in private hands for a while until 1906, when a group had purchased it and gave it to the state of California to become the historic site I have shared with you today. So if you come to the town of Sonoma today, what you're going to see is the church that General Vallejo built, the housing he built for his soldiers, we call that the barracks. He established the town plaza, and slowly the whole town of Sonoma built up around the remaining building of the mission. So all we have left today is the priest quarters and one of the original bells. But you may wonder, what exactly happened to the California Indians that were part of this mission when it ceased being a mission? Well, as payment, General Vallejo received a land grant for the work he was doing about 12 miles west of here. And he named that land grant Rancho de Petaluma. So he took most of the Indian laborers and their industries, transported them over to there so he could make money off of them. He kept some in town to continue to build the town of Sonoma, and others became servants for the Vallejo family. All right, so now we have time to take questions and comments, and I have time as long as people have questions.
We have such a good group. They have so many questions.
Okay.
So here's some about their education. Did they have books? Did they teach the Native Californians to read? And how or where did the kids learn?
Okay, that's a great question. And I get that a lot from students because they want to know, they hear about schools at the mission. But we have to think about who's going to school at a mission. Not everyone is. First off, in the 1800s, mostly women weren't taught. It was only men who were going to schools. Now, women did learn to read and write because they might have had a family member who taught them that, who wanted them to learn. But normally they didn't. So we're talking first about it's males who are learning. And then they're not going to send everyone to school because they need workers on a mission. So if everyone's going to school, that's not doing them any good. So they're hand-picking people to go to school. People who probably will eventually either become a priest or perhaps a soldier. So very few people actually go to school at the missions. The most educated person you are going to meet is the priest, because the priests do have to learn to read and write. They're constantly writing letters between the church and the government. So they're the most educated people you would have found at a mission. Next question.
Who healed the natives when they were sick?
Oh, that's a good one. Who healed the natives when they were sick? Mostly their own people. Now at the missions, the priest was supposed to have some basic medical knowledge, and maybe there was a soldier who had some medical knowledge, but there aren't hospitals around. All right. There was actually like 4 districts for the missions, and at each district there was supposed to be someone who was a doctor But your district is like, imagine the state of California being broken up into 4 areas and you only have 1 doctor for your area. That's not a good thing. So besides what medicine knowledge that the priest would have had, and maybe some basic access to things like certain types of like things that would have been like an aspirin, there wasn't a lot. So they did rely on the California Indians and some of their medical knowledge to help them out as well.
Okay, so the next question's about where everybody lived, because you showed the priest quarters, but did the native Californians have a separate place to live from, like, were wives and husbands separated, and were they separated from their kids?
So yeah, so like the priest quarters right here, it's attached to the compound. Now, interior wise, a lot of them did have what's called a monjeria or women's dormitory. So that was for single women, young ladies, probably about age 9 or up. As long as you were single, you were to live in that building alone. Well, not alone, you're living with other people, but away from your families at night. Once you became married, you would have moved out of there. You would have lived back in the family compound areas. Young men, I have heard some missions might have had a single men's dormitory that they lived in, or else they lived out in the family compounds. Now, the reason for keeping the women separate are kind of 2 reasons. One is that's a way to take away their traditions, their culture from them, because they aren't hearing the stories at night being around family. They then can tell them stories of Spain and get them indoctrinated into those traditions. Also, the priests didn't necessarily think that how the California Indians, how their forms of dating or relationships didn't fall under the way they wanted them to behave. So therefore, they could get them into how they thought dating or marriage was appropriate. So it's another change of tradition.
So the next one is a really big one. Why did the Spanish want to change the native Californians?
That's good. Why did they want to change it? Because Spain thought they were the best. I mean, in this time period, if you look at what's going on globally, all right, there's a lot of exploration going around. So Spain, Portugal, England, those are like 3 main countries that are going out, exploring lands, taking control away from the indigenous populations and making it their own. Actually got approval from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church had what was called the Doctrine of Discovery. And that was a doctrine they came up with that basically said, if you go out and explore and there are people there and they don't follow the ways of the Catholic Church, you are granted permission to take away their land and traditions and get them to convert to your way of life. So basically the Catholic Church gave permission for people to do this colonization, and they use that. And it's only because they thought they were the best.
Okay, thank you. Oh my gosh, we have so many good questions. So I'll try and group these a little bit. Were the children allowed to play? Was mission life hard or fun for kids? And did the kids have to go to church?
Well, I would never say mission life was fun, but they did have some downtime. So at a mission, people worked 6 days a week. They worked Monday through Saturday, sun up to sundown. As long as you were old enough to work, you worked. Even if you weren't old enough to work, there were probably jobs you could do, help out with your parents, things like that. There was always some sort of work to do no matter what age you were, unless you were a baby. So Sundays were a day off and a day to rest. So that's when people could really like gather together as a family. They could have some downtime to play some games, make dolls. There was a lot of guessing games that went on, some traditional games. So that was a time for them to really regroup and have it. But just 1 day a week after working 6 days, you're kind of exhausted. So I don't know how much was going on, but that was a day for them to do that.
And then did boys and girls both go to church?
Yes, men and women went to church. I have heard that sometimes that they would separate them from what men on one side, women on the other side. That I don't know too much about. I haven't researched it a lot. I do know though that kids tend to only go on Sundays. The adults went during the weekday masses, the daily masses, and then kids would come on Sunday. And the kids, if you go to church today, some churches have like a crying room, they call it, for young kids to stay in the back of the room. Well, guess what? All kids were in the back of the room. The adults were all forward and the kids would be in the back. All right, if you want, I can take one more question before we end.
Okay. All right. This will be our last question. So there were some holes in the wall of the church. What were they?
Oh, I think those are just cracks. Unfortunately, plaster, you sometimes get cracks in the wall. And you actually, you know, every like decade or so, you need to kind of re-plaster it. I know we have some cracks going on our wall out here. So they aren't anything special. I know with sometimes if you see, like you can actually make out the Adobe bricks, their candle holders were spiked at an end. So you could hold it and you could jab it into a wall. So that way it could hang off the wall and then you could take it out and carry it around with you. But those would have been way covered up by now with all the different kind of reconstructions, rehabilitation of this building. All right, so I thank you guys so much for coming on my tour today. You had a great questions. I hope you learned something new about our California missions. And if you're ever in the town of Sonoma, come visit us in person. You can actually see this site. All right, thank you guys so much for coming on my tour today.
Okay, thank you so much for hosting us. You were wonderful. We really appreciate it.